The woman had been standing at his gate for nearly 10 minutes before Harrison noticed her. That wasn't the thing that stopped him cold. What stopped him was the envelope she was holding against her chest, both hands pressed flat over it, the way a person carries something they're afraid to drop. He could see it from 40 yards out, white against the dark wool of her coat, and even at that distance, something about the handwriting on the front seized him in the throat. He hadn't seen that handwriting in 3 years. He had burned every piece of paper in the house that carried it, because he'd learned early that grief will find any surface it can. He didn't move. The woman at the gate didn't move either. She was watching him. The way people watch a dog they aren't sure about. Patient, still, giving him room to decide. "Mr. Cole," she called across the yard. Her voice was steady. "My name is Daisy Jennings. I have a letter for you." A pause. Margaret wrote it, as the wind came off the ridge and moved between them, carrying nothing but cold. Harrison set down the fence post he'd been carrying. He didn't walk toward her. He didn't walk away. He stood in the yard of the house he had let go half to ruin for 3 years, holding absolutely still, and tried to remember how to breathe. Diamonds. He opened the gate. He didn't take the envelope. He walked to the house and opened the back door and went inside without looking back. After a moment, he heard her footsteps on the porch boards. Careful. Measured, the footsteps of someone accustomed to uncertain welcomes. He considered the guest room for a moment before he showed it to her. It had been Margaret's room for visitors. She'd kept it ready, always fresh linens before each August when her cousin came. A small pot of dried flowers on the windowsill that she replaced every summer from what she gathered in the south field. The pot was still there. The flowers in it were long past dried, brittle gray things now, holding their shape through stubbornness alone. He'd walked past the open door 1,000 times in 3 years and never gone in. He'd never moved the pot. He showed Daisy the room and stood aside. She looked at the pot of dried flowers on the windowsill. Her face did something quiet and brief. She didn't comment. She set her bag down and thanked him. He went downstairs. He ate alone at the kitchen table. Bread and cold beans from that morning. He lit only one lamp and kept it low. After a while, he heard her moving upstairs, careful, unhurried. The movements of someone taking up space without imposing on it. He listened to the sound of someone learning a floor for the first time, mapping the places where it creaked and where it held. He couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, he came downstairs for water and found the envelope on the kitchen table. She had left it there and gone to bed without ceremony, without making it a moment that required his response. He stood in the doorway and looked at it from across the kitchen. His name was on the front, in that handwriting. He crossed to the table and sat down in the chair across from it. He looked at his name for a long time. The way she made the H in Harrison with 2 legs of precisely equal height. The way the letters in Cole had always tilted very slightly to the right, as if walking somewhere. He hadn't intended to memorize it. He'd simply looked at it for 12 years, and it had gone in without his permission, the way certain things do. He had burned the letters she'd written him while she was alive. The birthday letters. The notes she left on the table when she went to town. The list of things she'd been thinking about that she used to write on Sundays and leave on the windowsill. He'd burned all of it in the first 3 weeks after, and he'd told himself it was necessary, that having those surfaces in the house was incompatible with getting through the following day. He understood now, sitting across from this envelope, that none of it had worked. He still knew exactly how she made the H. The fire in the stove burned down to coals. The lamp on the shelf threw a low yellow light across the table and made the envelope look like the only solid thing in the room. He sat there until the cold came up through the floor and into his boots. He did not touch the envelope. He got up and went to the stove and put one more log on and stood there until the heat came back. Then he went to the window and looked out at the yard. Dark and still. The stable, the fence line, the road to Clearwater barely visible in the distance. He had stood at this window 1,000 times in 3 years and looked at this same view and seen the same thing, a yard that was his and that he had let go. The fence posts that needed resetting. The south paddock gate that stuck. The garden behind the house that Margaret had kept and that he'd let go back to weeds the 2nd year. He looked at all of it for a moment. Then he looked at the envelope on the table behind him. He could see its reflection faintly in the dark glass of the window. He went back to bed. This story is set in the Wyoming Territory in 1879. The characters and events depicted are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. It was open by morning. Harrison was at the kitchen table when Daisy came downstairs, one sheet of paper in his hand, the coffee he'd made an hour ago sitting untouched at his elbow. He didn't look up when she came into the kitchen. He heard her go to the stove. The scrape of the iron door, the knock of wood, the small hiss of the flame catching. Ordinary sounds. He hadn't realized how rarely he heard them until they were in the room again. "Did she tell you what was in them?" he said. He was still looking at the paper. "No," Daisy said. He folded the letter, slowly, with the particular care of a man who has decided the thing in his hands is fragile and will be treated as such. "They're numbered," he said. Just that. He set it on the table and stood and went outside. When he came back in at mid-morning, Daisy had left a second cup of coffee on the table, beside the letter. He stood looking at both cups for a moment before he sat down. He read the letter 3 more times that day. Not consecutively in pieces at different points. The way you come back to something, you're still deciding what it means. The second time he read it, he was standing at the kitchen counter. The third time he was in the field standing next to the fence he'd been meaning to repair, the letter flat in his hands and the cold wind coming off the ridge. The fourth time he was sitting on the porch in the early dark after supper, with no lamp, and he read it by memory more than by the fading light. He folded it very carefully when he was done, and went inside. The next morning, without saying anything, he moved the pot of dried flowers from the guest room windowsill to the shelf in the kitchen. He didn't throw it away. He just moved it where he could see it. The first week did not go the way he'd expected. He'd expected, without having thought it through, that her presence would be like a boarder's presence, separate, manageable, something he could organize himself around without being changed by it. Instead, she was simply there. The way weather is, they're not intrusive, not asking anything, but impossible to pretend wasn't happening. On the third evening, he came in from the field, and she'd moved the kitchen table 6 inches to the left. Not much, just enough to catch the better lamplight from the shelf. He stood there and looked at it. He'd eaten at that table in that exact spot for 12 years. Margaret had always said the light was wrong on that side. He sat down in the same chair, in the new position. She put the food on and sat across from him, and neither of them said anything about the table. He read the second letter on his own schedule. She didn't ask when he was going to. 2 days after she arrived, Harrison went into the barn in the afternoon while Daisy was at the well. He stopped at the doorframe. It had been hanging wrong since the fall of the previous year. The right hinge had worked partly loose, and the door dragged on the ground each time it moved, grinding the same rut in the dirt floor deeper with every use. He had walked past it 400 times in 18 months. He found the hammer and the right-size nail and a scrap of flat iron. He took the hinge off, entirely trimmed the wood behind it, where it had swelled, and reset the plate flush. He drove the nail into solid wood. He tested the door twice, full open, and back. Clean. No drag. He set the tools down and went back to the field. When Daisy came back from the well, she passed the barn door. He saw her stop from across the yard. She stood there for just a moment, looking at the door. Then she went inside, without saying anything. Neither of them mentioned it that evening or after. Diamonds, 3 days after she arrived. Harrison read the second letter sitting on the fence rail in the east pasture. He'd ridden out to check the line along the upper ridge and stopped the horse on the flat section where he could see the valley below and the road to Clearwater winding through the lower plain. The day was cold and clear, in the way that Wyoming winter days sometimes manage not warm, but bright enough that the snow on the high ridge looked almost white, and the shadows of the fence posts ran, long and precise, across the ground. He'd had the letter in his coat pocket since morning. He got off the horse and sat on the rail and held it for a while. The horse found a dry patch of grass and started pulling at it without any particular interest in what was happening nearby. He broke the seal. He read slowly. The second letter was shorter than the first. Margaret's handwriting was exactly as it had always been clear practiced, the hand of someone who believed words were worth the effort of forming them well. Halfway through, he stopped. He read one line again, and then it wasn't something he intended. He said it aloud, not loudly, just into the open air of the winter pasture. The way you test the sound of something before you can decide whether to trust it. "Harrison, You were always better at carrying things than putting them down. He stopped, looked up. The ridge was bright in the afternoon light. The horse was still working at the grass. A hawk was turning a thermal somewhere above the creek patient, and unhurried. Nothing had changed. He had just heard her voice in the open air for the first time in 3 years. He folded the second letter more carefully than the first. He put it in his shirt pocket instead of his coat. Closer. Daisy rode to town 4 days after she arrived. The general store in Clearwater was the kind of place where information moved faster than goods. It had been that way as long as anyone in the county could remember. The front counter served as a clearing house for everything worth knowing inside 15 miles. By the time Daisy had made her way through the list and reached the back, the storekeeper's wife had already found a reason to come out from the dry goods side. The supplies were ordinary: flour, salt, lamp oil, dried beans, coffee. She was reading off of the list when a man came in from the feed at older gray at the temples, with the careful face of a man who has done difficult things slowly and knows the cost of each one. He introduced himself as Ellis Parrish. "I drove the wagon at Mrs. Cole's burial," he said when she looked at him. His hat was in both hands, turning at the brim. "I've known Harrison going on 15 years. He met her eyes directly. There was nothing unkind in it, just the look of a man delivering something he's thought through more than once. "I don't say this to cause offense, but he's not the man he was before she passed. A number of us have been watching him these 3 years, and I'd hate to see you come all this distance, form an attachment to an idea of what might happen, and find yourself worse off than when you started." He paused. "Some people don't come back from a loss like that," Ellis said. "Not all the way back." Daisy looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting 3 years for him to be ready." Ellis seemed to need a moment with that. He nodded slowly and put his hat back on his head. He started to turn away and then stopped himself. "There might be some family coming," he said. "From Cheyenne Way, Margaret's side." He seemed to decide something. "I just thought you ought to know ahead of time." He went back into the feed side. Daisy paid for the supplies and walked out to her horse. Main Street was quiet in the way Clearwater was usually quiet in late winter. Not empty, but settled into itself, everyone doing what needed doing without unnecessary motion. She stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck and looked down the street at the ordinary life of the town going about its ordinary business. A town that had already written Harrison Cole's ending. Had written it 3 years ago, she could see that clearly, and had grown comfortable with it. The way people grow comfortable with monuments. After a while, they stop, expecting the monument to move. She got on and rode back. She passed the church cemetery on the edge of town. A few rows of plain markers angled against the prevailing wind, the way they all were out here. She didn't stop. She kept her eyes on the road and rode. The letter from Laramie First Bank arrived on a Thursday with the ordinary mail. Harrison found it at the kitchen counter, read it once, standing, and set it on the table beside the coffee pot. 60 days, the amount plainly stated. He had known the debt was there. The way you know about a bad tooth through a winter, and you manage around it, and you let it sit until you can't. Daisy saw it when she came in from outside. She looked at it long enough to understand the shape of the situation, and went to the stove, and started the breakfast without comment. He watched her crack 2 eggs into the pan. He'd had eggs alone every morning for 3 years. The change in that had happened gradually enough that he hadn't tracked when it began to feel like a change. He folded the bank letter and put it in the drawer under the counter. He poured his coffee and went out. Daisy had been asleep for an hour when Harrison read the 3rd letter. He sat at the kitchen table with the stove burning on its middle setting and the lamp on the lower wick. He'd been holding the envelope for a while before he opened it longer than usual, with a reluctance he hadn't had with the first 2. The first 2 had been warm in different ways. He had understood from letter 2 that the remaining ones were going to ask something of him, and he wasn't sure he was ready to know what. He opened it and read. Halfway through, there was a place where he stopped and looked at the far wall for a long time. The wall had a crack in the plaster along the upper corner that had been there since he'd bought the place. He'd been meaning to repair it for 2 years. He went back to the top and read the letter again from the beginning. Margaret's voice was exactly as he remembered it. The particular directness, the way she'd always said the thing she meant without finding the route around it first. She was never unkind about it, She had understood that being gentle with a person didn't require being imprecise with them, and she had never confused the two. The letter said, "You were in that barn because you believed you could always come back. You have spent 3 years proving yourself wrong. I need you to understand something, Harrison. I never agreed with your verdict." The fire in the stove settled. A log shifted, and the coals dropped, and the kitchen filled briefly with the sound of it. And then, the quiet came back. Harrison sat with his hands flat on the table. He looked at both of them side by side on the wood. 12 years of ranch work, and they showed it. He'd had those hands his whole adult life, and he wasn't sure he'd ever examined them this carefully. He sat there until the lamp needed trimming. He didn't trim it. He went to bed in the dark. In the morning before breakfast, he went out and split the cord of firewood that had been sitting as unsplit rounds beside the barn for 4 months. He was done before Daisy came downstairs. When she came outside to start the breakfast fire, she looked at the split wood, the fresh pale faces of it, neatly stacked, and went inside without saying anything. In the days between the 3rd letter and the 4th, the ranch started functioning the way it used to. Not because either of them decided it would. It just did. On the 4th evening, he came in from the field and found she had repaired the crack in the kitchen wall, plaster the one along the upper corner that he'd been looking at for 2 years. She'd mixed the plaster and applied it and smoothed it out, and it was drying. He looked at it for a moment. He didn't say anything. He went to wash his hands. Later, when the lamp was low, she said, "I didn't know if you'd prefer I left it." He looked at the wall. "No," he said. "It's fine." They finished eating. It was the longest conversation they'd had that week. That night he could not find letter 2. He checked his shirt pocket, his coat pocket, the kitchen table. He looked on the shelf where he'd been putting them. He found it eventually on the windowsill in his bedroom, where he must have set it without thinking. He hadn't known he'd been carrying it around the house. He put it back with the others. He went to bed. The following afternoon, Daisy was trying to reset a fence post in the south paddock. The ground had softened in the recent thaw, and the post kept shifting. She'd pack the dirt in and tamp it, and it would hold for 2 minutes, and then ease sideways again. Harrison was crossing the yard on his way to the barn. He stopped. He picked up the post driver from where she'd leaned it against the fence rail. He drove the post 3 times, clean vertical, into solid ground, and it held. He set the driver down and kept walking. Daisy straightened up and looked at the post. She didn't say anything. She went back to work. 10 days after she arrived, Harrison read the 4th letter on the porch in the late afternoon. He got 2 paragraphs in and stopped. He read the section again, holding the paper very still. He set it down on the porch rail and looked out at the pasture for a moment. The horses at the far end in, the flat gray light, the upper fence line running along the rise. Then he picked the letter up and read it to the end. He went inside. Daisy was at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper, working through the monthly supply calculations. The lamp was on between them, the kitchen warm. "She knew you," Harrison said. He was standing in the doorway. Daisy looked up. "Not through an agency," he said. "She knew you before any of this. She knew you before." "Yes." "How long?" Daisy set the pencil down. "We grew up in the same county," she said. "Ohio. We'd known each other since we were girls. 22 years. Harrison stood in the doorway with the letter in his hand. The lamp was between them. In its light, he could see Daisy's face clearly, the particular stillness in it that he'd been reading, up to now, as reserve or patience. He understood it differently now. It was neither of those things. It was the stillness of a person who has been holding a significant weight for a long time, and has learned to hold it without letting the effort show. He thought about the barn door, the fence post, the second cup of coffee left on the table every morning without comment or expectation. He thought about the plate on the porch step the night he hadn't come in for supper. He thought about the pot of dried flowers in the guest room that she'd looked at once, and then let alone. He thought about the way she'd looked at it, the brief quiet thing her face had done, which he had not understood at the time, and understood now. She had known which room it was. She had known Margaret. She had walked into that room and seen those dried flowers, and she had known exactly who had kept them there, and why, and she had said nothing. She had set down her bag, and thanked him, and said nothing. 22 years. He went outside and walked to the barn, and stayed there. He didn't come in for supper. Daisy put a plate together and carried it to the porch and set it on the step. She went back inside and washed the pans. She sat at the kitchen table with her mending. The Wyoming evening was the kind of quiet that comes at the end of a long, cold winter. Not peaceful, but emptied out. The land had been cold for months and had stopped making much sound about it. Through the kitchen window she could hear, if she listened, the occasional shift of horses in the barn, the creak of the door in the wind. She sat until near midnight. In the morning the plate was gone, and Harrison was already in the east pasture. She made the coffee and left his cup on the table. When he came in at mid-morning, he poured it and stood at the window. "You didn't tell me," he said. "No." "She asked you not to." Daisy looked at her hands. "She said to let you decide first, whether you wanted me here at all. She knew if you found out ahead of time that she'd sent someone she trusted." A pause. "She said you'd try to honor it for her sake. She didn't want that. She wanted it to be my own decision." "Yes." Harrison drank his coffee. Outside the window, the yard was clear in the morning light. She'd cleaned the window last week, and the light came through it differently now. "She knew me," he said. "Yes," Daisy said. "She did." He set the cup down and went out. That afternoon, without being asked, he spent 2 hours resetting the south paddock gate that had been sticking since the summer before last. He didn't mention it. When Daisy went out to feed the chickens, she passed it and tested the swing of it. It moved freely. She went on to the chicken coop. She came on a Wednesday 2 weeks after Daisy arrived. Harrison was splitting wood at the side of the house when the hired buggy came up the road. He set the axe down and waited. He could tell before the buggy stopped that the woman inside had prepared herself for something it was in. The uprightness of how she sat, the posture of someone who has decided in advance not to be turned around. She had Margaret's eyes, green-gray with the dark ring at the iris, the same shape to them. It was like looking at someone he knew through a pane of glass that distorted everything. The man beside her wore a lawyer's coat, too well kept for road travel, chosen for impression. "Mr. Cole," and she climbed down without waiting for assistance. "I am Vera Holt. Margaret was my sister. I believe you have letters that belong to my family." Harrison said nothing. Daisy was in the barn doorway 40 feet back. "The letters are mine," Harrison said. "Margaret was not in sound judgment during the final period of her illness," Vera said. "Documents produced under those conditions. She was in sound mind." Vera looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at Daisy in the barn doorway, and something in her face tightened, not dramatically but visibly. The tightening of someone encountering exactly what they came to object to. "We will be filing a petition with the county clerk's office." And she nodded at the lawyer who produced an envelope from his coat. "You have 10 days from the date of filing to respond with documentation." Harrison took the envelope. Vera looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned and got back in the buggy with the precise movements of someone who has done what they came to do. The lawyer followed. The buggy turned in the yard and went back down the road without hurry. Harrison stood with the legal document in his hand. He read it where he stood. He read it a second time, not because it was unclear, but because he needed the moment. Then he folded it and went inside and set it on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it for a while before he went back out to finish the wood. Diamonds, the 5th letter, came on a Sunday. Daisy brought it upstairs and knocked once on his door and left it on the floor outside and went back down. The door at the bottom of the stairwell was open. She hadn't thought to close it. She was making the midday meal. She heard him open the door to his room, heard him come forward, pick it up, heard him go back inside. She kept working. She cut the carrots and the onion and put them in the pot with what remained of Thursday's roast. She covered it and turned the heat low. She stood at the counter. After a while, the house went quiet in a specific way. She wasn't moving, wasn't cutting anything, or moving pans. She was standing with her hands on the counter, and the kitchen still, and the wind outside moving through the eaveboards in a low, even sound. From upstairs, not loudly, not directed anywhere, just said into the air the way a man talks when he is certain he is alone. She knew. 2 words, barely more than a breath. Daisy set down what she was holding and closed her eyes. She knew what was in the 5th letter. Margaret had described all 7 to her that fall in Ohio, sitting up in bed with the afternoon light coming through the west window. The 5th had been the hardest to write. She'd written it 3 times before she was satisfied. What it said was not cruel. Margaret had never been cruel, but it was aimed with precision, directly at the specific fear she'd carried all the way to the end. Not that Harrison wouldn't survive. She'd known he would survive. What she'd feared was worse than that he would use her memory as a reason to stop trying. That he would turn grief into a form of loyalty, and loyalty into a cage he mistook for devotion, and never understand that she would have wanted none of it. She'd been afraid of exactly what had happened, and she had never said it while she was alive, because she had known him, and known exactly how he would carry it as one more verdict against himself. He had just heard it. From upstairs through an open door, 2 words he hadn't meant anyone to hear. Daisy stood at the counter with her hands still. She heard him come downstairs. She turned. He held out the second document, the one from the county clerk's office. The petition had been formally filed that morning, 10 days to appear with documentation establishing the letters as his. If he couldn't provide documentation, the letters would revert to the Holt family estate at the magistrate's discretion. Harrison had no documentation. Margaret had written the letters alone in private in the afternoons of her last fall in Ohio. He hadn't known they existed until Daisy came through his gate. He set the paper on the table. He walked out. The barn door opened and the afternoon went quiet. He stayed in the barn for 4 hours. Daisy left a lamp on in the kitchen. She heard him eventually, moving around out there, not the sounds of tending the horses, but something slower, without rhythm. She looked out the kitchen window at the light under the barn door. She went to bed and left the lamp burning. He came in well after dark. She heard the back door, the sound of the pump, the scrape of a chair. After a while, the kitchen went quiet. She lay awake listening until it did, and then she slept. In the morning, he was already outside when she came down. There was mud on his boots by the door that hadn't been there the evening before. On the kitchen table, he'd left the coffee pot on the low heat, which he'd never done before. She stood there for a moment, looking at it, the coffee pot on the low heat, the way you keep things warm for someone you expect to come back. She poured 2 cups. He came in at mid-morning and drank his without looking at her. He went back out. She washed the cups. Harrison worked through those 3 days. He repaired the creek fence that had been weak since fall. He patched the smokehouse where a board had shifted. On the practical surface, he was present, and the ranch continued. But there was a flatness to it, the mechanical quality of a man going through the motions of a life without any particular investment in the outcome. The letters sat on the table in the front room in their neat stack, and he did not look at them when he passed. On the second afternoon, Daisy was splitting wood behind the house. She'd been at it for an hour, working through the larger rounds. On one swing, the axe glanced off a knot in the wood, and the handle came up wrong, and she lost the grip halfway through the stroke. The axe dropped into the mud. She stood there. She didn't pick it up. She sat down on the splitting block and put her hands on her knees and looked at the muddy axe in the mud and simply stopped. She wasn't crying. There was nothing so specific as that. She was sitting in the gray afternoon light with the cold coming up through the wood under her, and she was thinking about a woman she had known for 22 years, a woman who had died in a bed in Ohio in October, who had sent Daisy away before the end because she needed the room quiet to write the last letter. "Go on," she'd said. "I'll be done before you make it to the county line," making a joke with no breath to spare for it the way Margaret always had. She'd needed to be alone for the last one. She'd known Daisy would stay if she wasn't asked to go, so Daisy had gone. She'd waited 3 years, the way Margaret asked. She'd honored it with the same stubbornness Margaret had counted on. And now, she was sitting on a splitting block in Wyoming in February, with 3 years of waiting sitting in her chest and a man in the barn who didn't know what to do with what he'd just learned, and an axe in the mud, and the gray afternoon closing in from all sides. She heard the back door. She didn't look up. Harrison crossed the yard without speaking. He didn't come to her. He sat down on the smaller stump about 6 feet away, the one they used for kindling, and he put his forearms on his knees and looked at roughly the same patch of ground she was looking at. He didn't speak. He didn't offer anything. He just sat there in the cold afternoon, the same way she was sitting 2 people looking at the same mud. After a while, Daisy reached down and picked up the axe. Harrison got up and went back inside. She split the wood. On the 3rd evening, a horse came up the road. Vera had left the lawyer behind this time. She knocked once and came onto the porch. Harrison came to the door. He'd been in the front room with a lamp on, reading a farm almanac that had lived on the shelf for years, the nearest thing to a book in the house. "She wrote those letters so you could live," Vera said. No greeting, no softening of any kind. She stood on the porch in the early dark, and her voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone who has decided that patience has been fully exhausted. "You have spent 3 years proving she wasted her time." Harrison stood in the doorway. Vera's face was still. Not angry, something worse than angry. Certain. The specific certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're saying and does not require his response in order to believe it. She turned and went back down the porch steps. He heard her horse move off down the road in the dark. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The almanac was still in his left hand. He put it down on the hall table. He went to the front room and picked up the 6th letter. He read it at the kitchen table, with the lamp turned up. The handwriting was different from the first 5. He noticed it on the first line, the letters smaller and pressed close together, each one more deliberate in a way that deliberate is different from careful. Like each word had required a separate decision. The pen had pressed harder in some places and barely touched the paper in others, the force behind it inconsistent in a way none of the earlier letters had been. He had looked at Margaret's handwriting every day for 12 years. He knew exactly what it looked like when she was tired or hurrying or writing by poor light. This was none of those things. This was handwriting produced by a body running out of what it needed to hold a pen. He read through the letter twice without stopping. When he finished the second time, he looked at his own hands, both flat on the table, and held very still for a moment. Then he got up and went to the stairs. It was past 10 at night. He knocked on Daisy's door. She opened it. She'd been awake, there was a lamp on behind her. "Did she know," he said, "that she wasn't going to make it?" Daisy looked at him. "Yes." "How long?" "3 months before," she said. "Maybe a little longer." Harrison leaned against the doorframe. The hallway was dark except for the light from Daisy's room and the low light from the kitchen below. "And she spent that time writing 7 letters. Daisy didn't answer. They both stood there in the dim hallway. Neither of them had anything to add to what had just been said. "The handwriting changes," Harrison said. "I know," Daisy said. He went back downstairs. He rode to Laramie on Friday, 20 miles through a country that was still white at the higher elevations and gray below, the sky overcast in the flat way it stays for weeks in late winter in Wyoming. He knew this road by its details, where the creek ran close to the trail, where the wind came through the gap in the hills, where the river valley opened below, and the town appeared. He had ridden it hundreds of times without thinking about it. Today he thought about it more than usual, because thinking about the road was easier than thinking about what he was riding toward. He'd left the 7th letter on the kitchen table. Sealed. The bank first. The loan officer looked at him with the expression of a man who had privately written off this account 2 years ago and is now reconsidering. Harrison put the cattle ledger on the desk. The numbers were adequate. 3 years of neglecting the house had not translated into neglecting the stock. That had been simple morning-by-morning repetition, and he'd been capable of that much. They restructured the note against the cattle value. 60 days became 18 months. Harrison signed, took his copy, left. He stopped at the county clerk's office on his way to the livery. Vera's lawyer was sitting on the bench outside the door, reading something, and when he looked up and saw Harrison coming, he folded the paper and stood. He had the particular discomfort of a man who has been carrying information he wasn't authorized to carry, and has been arguing with himself about it for days. He set it down. He spoke quickly, not quite meeting Harrison's eyes. He said Vera had been with Margaret in the final weeks in Ohio. Said Margaret had spent those last afternoons reading the letters aloud to her sister, the way they'd read to each other as children, all 7 of them, before the envelopes were sealed. Vera had heard every word. "She knows what they say," Harrison said. "All of them." "Yes," the lawyer said. "Why file the petition?" The lawyer looked at the door of the clerk's office. "There is a letter," he said carefully, "one of the 7, in which Margaret wrote about the estrangement between them, about Miss Holt arriving later than she should have." He stopped. He was choosing words the way you choose steps when the ground is uncertain. "About what she'd decided regarding that." "About forgiving her," Harrison said. The lawyer didn't answer. "Vera doesn't want those letters accessible," Harrison said, "because one of them proves her sister died having forgiven her for coming too late." And the lawyer put his papers under his arm and walked into the clerk's office without responding. Harrison stood in the Laramie Street. He thought about Vera on the porch in the early dark. She wrote those letters so you could live. He thought about what it costs a person to say something that true and mean it as an accusation. He went to the livery and got his horse. He rode home. The 20 miles back felt longer. He rode slowly and thought about Vera in that room in Ohio, listening to her dying sister read 7 letters aloud in the October afternoons, and then getting in a buggy 3 years later to try to take them back. He thought about what that cost her. He didn't feel sorry for her, but he thought about it. When he came in that evening, the 7th letter was where he'd left it on the kitchen table, sealed, with Margaret's handwriting on the front. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook and went upstairs without picking it up. The small claims hearing was held Monday morning in the back room of the Clearwater courthouse. It was the kind of room that served too many purposes. Wooden chairs, a single desk, a window facing the street, cold light coming through. It smelled of paper and old wood. Harrison arrived before Vera and stood at the back wall. Vera came in with her lawyer a few minutes later. She looked at Harrison and sat down without speaking. Ellis Parrish came in last and took a chair in the back corner with his hat on his knee. He'd walked over from the feed store without telling anyone he was coming. The lawyer presented the petition briefly and precisely, documents produced during a terminal illness, no witnessed record of intended recipients, the sole surviving blood relative with clear legal standing. He made it sound straightforward because in legal terms it was fairly straightforward. The magistrate looked at Harrison. Harrison reached into his coat and placed all 6 letters on the clerk's desk in a stack in order, numbered side up. He had read each one multiple times. He knew the progression of her handwriting across all 6, the clear practiced letters of the first, the deliberate lines of the last. He knew what she'd written about guilt, about fear, about what she'd needed him to understand. He had carried them in his coat for 3 weeks, and they had done the work they were designed to do. "My wife wrote these to me," he said. "I've read 6 of them. The 7th is at the house unread. They're mine." Vera's lawyer started to speak. Harrison looked at him. The lawyer stopped. He looked at Vera directly. She was sitting very still. "She forgave you in one of these," he said. "I think you know which one." The room was quiet. "I'm not going to use it against you," he said, "but I'm not giving them back." Vera looked at the stack of letters on the desk. She looked at Harrison. Something in her face was working through something that had been fixed in one position for a long time. After a long moment, she said quietly to her lawyer, "Withdraw the petition." He started to object. She said it again. He withdrew the petition. Harrison gathered the letters from the desk and walked outside. Daisy was standing in the street with both horses. She'd come in case and waited outside because it hadn't been her hearing to attend. Vera came out behind Harrison and walked down the steps and crossed toward the lawyer's buggy. When she reached Daisy, she stopped. She looked at Daisy for a moment. Something that had been closed in her face had been opened briefly against its intention. "She chose well," Vera said, quietly, not unkindly. She got in the buggy. It pulled away down the main street of Clearwater, and she didn't look back. Ellis Parrish came out and stood on the courthouse step and watched it go. He looked at Harrison. He put his hat on and nodded once. Harrison nodded back. He went the next morning before dawn. He dressed in the cold and dark, moving through the house without a lamp. He knew the floor now, which boards gave and which held. He took the 7th letter from the kitchen table and went out through the back door. The sky was the deep blue that comes just before the dark decides to end. The frost on the yard gave back a pulphoint light, so that the whole ground seemed to have its own dim illumination. He crossed the yard and passed the barn and went up the slope along the fence line toward the far edge of the property where the posts ran close to the trees. 2 stones. Margaret had chosen the spot herself the spring before she died. She'd wanted to be able to see the valley. He sat down between the markers on the frozen ground. The cold came through his clothes immediately. He looked at the valley below, barely visible in the pre-dawn dark, the creek, a faint, pale line, the road to Clearwater, a thread through the land. He held the envelope for a while. Then he opened it. The handwriting in the 7th letter was the worst he'd seen. Written last when she was nearest the end, and it showed in every word the smaller letters barely formed, the longer ones drifting slightly from their line, as if the hand that made them had been working against something. But it was legible. She had made it legible. Whatever it had cost her in those last days to hold the pen and form words, she had made sure he could read what she'd written. He read it slowly. Somewhere in the middle, he stopped and looked up at the valley. The sky in the east was beginning to go from deep blue to the first faint gray. He could make out the outline of the house below the barn, the fence line running down the slope. He looked back down at the paper. Her voice in his head was clear and precise, and exactly as it had always been. "You were in the barn because I asked you to go. I heard the horse, and I told you it sounded bad. And I sent you out because I didn't want you to see what might happen. That decision was mine, not yours. You picked up something that was never yours to carry, and you have been carrying it for 3 years, and I am asking you now to put it down. I know what you do with guilt. I watched you do it your whole life. The way you held on to a mistake long past any useful purpose. The way you thought it was the right way to honor a thing that had gone wrong. It was one of the things I loved about you. You took everything seriously. But I am asking you to take this seriously. Now, what happened that night was not your fault. I sent you to the barn. I made that choice. And then I died, which I did not choose either, but which is not the same as abandoning you. I sent Daisy because she is the person I trust most in the world, and because she has been waiting 3 years, because I asked her to wait, and that means there is something worth coming home to. I loved you. That doesn't stop, because I did. But love that keeps you from living isn't love. It's just another kind of ruin. And you were never in 12 years a man who wanted to live in ruins. Lay it down, Harrison. Not for me. You've been doing things for me long enough. Diamonds. He sat without moving for a long time. The frost on the grass softened slowly as the light increased. The valley below came into clarity in stages, the creek first, then the road, then the barn with the door square in its frame, and finally the house with smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney in a thin, straight line into the still air. She was awake. She'd started the stove. He looked at the letter in his hands once more. Then he folded it carefully in quarters the way he'd folded every one of them over these past 3 weeks, and he placed it under the flat stone at the base of the marker. He pressed it down with both hands to make sure it was secure. He stood. He turned. Daisy was at the fence line 20 yards back. She had followed at a distance he wouldn't have seen from the house, and she had stopped at the fence and come no further. Her hands were in her coat pockets. Her breath made small clouds in the still air. She was watching him. The same way she'd been watching him since she arrived, without demand, without urgency, without any indication that she was going anywhere. Harrison looked at her. He stepped away from the grave. He walked toward the fence. He stopped 2 feet from her and held out his hand. Not reaching, not urgent. His hand open, offered, in the early morning light on the frozen slope above the valley, where he had spent 3 years learning to do without. Diamonds. Daisy took it. Her hand was cold. His was cold. They stood there on the fence line without speaking. The frost still on the grass, the smoke rising straight from the chimney below, the first proper light of morning coming across the ridge from the east and moving slowly down the slope toward the valley. Then they walked back to the house. The barn door was square in its frame. The gate was closed but unlatched. The fence in the south paddock ran straight. The east pasture spread out in the pale early light, the horses moving slowly along the upper line. She went inside to finish the breakfast. He stopped at the barn to check on the horses the way he had every morning for 20 years. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the door swinging clean and quiet on its hinge. No drag, no rut, and looked back up the slope toward the 2 stones barely visible now in the growing light. The dried flowers from the guest room were on the kitchen shelf when he came in. He'd moved them weeks ago. He could see them through the window in the morning light while he stood in the barn doorway. He went in to feed the horses. When he came inside, Daisy had made the eggs and the coffee, and the kitchen smelled like both. She put his plate on the table and sat down across from it. He hung up his coat on the hook behind the door. He sat down. They ate in the morning light. The kitchen she had cleaned, the house he had let fall, both of them in the process of restoring it. Outside the ridge caught the first full light of the morning and held it. The yard was visible through the window, the south paddock gate swinging free, the water trough full and holding the east fence running straight. He had not noticed until this morning how much of the place was working again. He poured a second cup of coffee and left the pot on the low heat. He sat back down. A man is not faithful to the dead by refusing to live. He is faithful by living in a way that proves he was loved. This story is set in the Wyoming Territory in 1879. The characters and events depicted are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.